Welcome to Dr. Doctor, the award-winning radio show and podcast featuring your physician host, Dr. Andrew Mullally.
And I'm Dr. Chris Stroud. And this is the show where we and our guests discuss relevant health-related topics, and it will always be from an authentically Catholic perspective.
Today, our guest will be heard across the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. For the first time on Dr. Doctor, our guest today will be Sister Brigid Mary Meeks, a sister with the Religious Sisters of Mercy based in Elma, Michigan. She's also a lawyer, and hopefully she can help us explain some of the legal challenges related to Catholic hospitals, the problems that they face in our current climate, and also the relationship they have with their local bishop.
Yeah, we've had a sister who was a colonel and a surgeon. I don't think that we've had a religious who's a lawyer. This is the first, I think.
Yeah, and that's I'm excited to hear from her because her order is very special. I'll let her tell about it a little bit, but they're all super educated in secular disciplines in addition to the spiritual disciplines.
Wow, that's
which is really cool. So, Chris, tell me just Catholic hospitals throughout your career. What's your experience been?
Yeah, mine's been pretty limited. I have been involved with a Catholic system, a large Catholic system that we shall not name. That's very large, and it was a good experience, I would have to say, overall. I think part of the challenges for me is I went in with some very high expectations. Mm-hmm. I was actually a patient and was operated on in a Catholic hospital not too long ago, and I went in with some really high expectations. Which probably isn't fair to them, but I was crucifix counting from the minute that I walked in.
That's funny,
and that may not be fair. But I was also looking for signs that I'm not in just a hospital that decorates differently.
Yeah.
Am I in a religious institution? So I would have to say it was a mix. I had some sense of that, but I also saw opportunities that I thought were really sorely missed.
Yeah, it's interesting. In kind of preparing for the show a little bit, I took the liberty of Googling Catholic hospitals. And what came up to me was very interesting because it was mostly abortion-related stuff about what the Catholic hospitals can't do or won't do, putting women at risk, etc. It was an interesting touchstone because the times I've thought about it in the past are, at least in my experiences, has largely been times I'm like, man, you're missing an opportunity here to really be Catholic. I've had some really good experiences too. One of the institutions where I trained at was a Catholic hospital. Mm-hmm. And it was really interesting because especially in family medicine training, this was actually kind of in the OB realm. Just a little story. We had a pregnant lady we were caring for, and ultimately she found on ultrasound that the baby had anencephaly, which is a malformation that generally is not compatible with life longer than minutes or hours.
Yeah.
And so unfortunately the standard of care in that community was early induction, which is kind of inducing abortion by delivering the baby early. But the Catholic hospital, all the nurses on the OB floor said, well, you can't do that here. And they're not all Catholic. Some of them were, but they knew right off the bat.
This is a no-go.
This is a no-go. This is an abortion. We cannot do that. We won't do that. Which was so, I loved it because a lot of times, at least for myself in training, you kind of feel like an island. You're walking on eggshells, but here you're like, gee whiz, I do have other people who are advocating for this. It was a really good opportunity also to talk to the other residents that I worked with because they did not get it at all. They're like, what is the deal here? I don't understand. And so we had a really good discussion about how this was pretty much just an abortion with maybe different words that people like to use. And so really good experience there. On the other side, you hear about Catholic hospitals that get out of line sometimes, and you couldn't tell the difference between a Catholic or a secular hospital with performing things that are against the ethical and religious directives. So, that's one of the big questions is obviously I think with both our stories, we expect a lot.
We do. Our expectations are high, and shouldn't they be? And maybe they should be even higher than they are.
Yeah.
But, I think a story that plays out in far too many communities where there's a Catholic hospital and a secular or a non-Catholic private hospital, that the physicians move back and forth between those facilities.
Yeah.
And the Catholic hospital is at constant odds with, well, if I don't let them do that here, they'll take their business across the street
Yes.
and we'll close. Sort of that, no margin, no mission. Catholic hospitals have to stay open, but they don't have to sacrifice their ethics to stay in business. We know that. But I know that gets played out in America every day, and it is disappointing. I think, to your point, we're missing opportunities to witness and to be great.
Yes.
And I'm sure our guest is going to have some really fascinating insight and examples of that.
Yeah, I'm intrigued because she's working in healthcare administration as a lawyer, and as a nun. So good grief, she'll have some good stuff for us. I guess one of the other things we want to be sure that we touch on too. I think I get this idea a lot. I don't know. I'm probably not the only one, but when you see sometimes a Catholic institution, whether it be a college or a hospital or something, not living up to the values that we expect, you're like, I wish I could fix that. Well, why doesn't their bishop fix that? And sometimes you look at the bishops and you're like, I'm surprised. And so one of the things that I'm interested to hear about as well, that she has kind of spoken to Tom a little bit about, is the bishops have some real limitations in kind of keeping Catholic institutions in line, but they also have some opportunities as well. So I'm interested to get that story straight, just to know what's really unreasonable to expect and what is very reasonable to hope for and encourage in that relationship.
Yeah, I'm sure that all of us could think of things that our priests and our bishops could and should do better.
Yeah, why haven't they asked me yet?
That's right. And I had a conversation with my priest recently, and I thought I'd really caught him in an opportunity that he'd missed. And then he went on to explain to me the layers and layers and layers of challenges to what I was suggesting. And I was humbled and gained newfound respect.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to learn, as we already know, being a bishop's not an easy role.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean there's not opportunities. And so maybe some of our bishop listeners will learn from Sister when she comes on.
Sometimes I think, for the lay people, maybe inaction does not mean it wasn't considered and decided against for good reasons.
And sometimes no means not now, right?
That's
well,
right.
With that, it's probably a good time to segue into our trivia question for this episode. And not surprisingly, the topic is Catholic hospitals.
That's right. Yeah, historically, the church invented hospitals.
Now, we hear that on commercials and things all the time. And to the casual listener, that may be a little tough to recognize. But this idea that you group sick people together, even down to the nurse's hat, has evolved. It's not worn anymore.
Yeah.
But that evolved because it was a sister's habit.
Yes.
But the church invented this idea we could care for people better if we got them in one building.
Well, and that's one of the reasons why the Hippocratic Oath has hung around for so long about caring for people, because it was such a novel idea. Before Christ, really the wealthy or kind of soldiers trying to keep them on the job, they got some level of health care, but it wasn't for the regular people.
Yeah.
And so the question is, Catholic hospitals. Currently, the 10 largest Catholic health systems operate more than 76,000 short-term acute hospital beds. So the question, what is the percentage of hospitals in America currently run by these big Catholic health systems?
Great question.
Question again.
Well, you're going to have to listen, listeners, to the end of the episode to get to the answer to that brilliant trivia question. So we hope you'll stay with us. We'll be back after the break on Dr. Doctor.
And we are back on Dr. Doctor today with Sister Brigid Mary Meeks, native of Denver, Colorado, did undergraduate school at Davidson College in North Carolina on a soccer scholarship.
It seems like we should pause right there. So we're talking to a nun who's a lawyer who's a soccer star.
Yeah, I think that's D1 too, so that's pretty impressive. She joined the Religious Sisters of Mercy in 2013. Served as the coordinator for the Department of Religion at St. Francis Health in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Got a master's in science and bioethics in 2019 at the University of Mary, and then went on to do law school at Villanova, where she just graduated. She's got a special interest in criminal law, especially where it relates to health care in trying to care for human trafficking victims and people suffering in the cycle of prostitution. And she started, or is starting, a human trafficking response program at her hospital, which I was very excited to hear about. Sister, thank you for coming on Dr. Doctor.
Thank you for having me.
Now, our listeners, I know, they're chomping at the bit, as they say, to know your story. So maybe we could begin with a little bit of your journey and how you ended up sitting here as the person you are talking to us.
Wow. Well, I guess we could begin with my baptism, but that will take a long time. So, I when I went to Davidson, I guess to backtrack, when I was 10 years old, I wrote in my journal, God, I know what I want for the rest of my life. You,
Wow.
I love God. But then I proceeded to immediately also start detailing all the guys that I liked. And I didn't want to leave any guy out. So I listed every single guy in my fifth grade class at the time. And so, religious weren't around me growing up. I hadn't ever seen really a religious sister. My mom had taken me to Walburga Abbey in Colorado, just outside the border of Colorado and Wyoming. And so I had seen cloistered nuns, but I didn't feel called to that, and didn't know that there was anything else. I just thought to be a sister meant you were cloistered on this set of land for the rest of your life, and which is some person's call, but I knew it wasn't mine. And so I quickly supplanted the Lord with athletics and academics, and pursued it truly as a real love for, there was a certain innocence to it, though it did quickly override the Lord, but unintentionally. And so, and soccer conflicted with church on Sundays. Soccer won when I was tired from soccer, having been on a Saturday and it was a Sunday. The tiredness from soccer won out. And pretty soon, even when it was convenient for me to go to church, I no longer was in college. And yet I still carried a holy water with me to every soccer game and practice, and would pray that the Lord would glorify what I did. That to me meant that I'd score goals and do well. But in time, He used soccer as the way in which He reached me again. And that included suffering and injuries, and it being ultimately stripped away from me when I graduated, and all of a sudden this life I had planned was no more in some sense. I had been working for it since the age of 4, and competitive soccer was finished, and academics, which I had succeeded in also for a period of time, had finished after I graduated. And so I remember then finally returning back to, I guess you'd say, the very first love, and going back to church and experiencing adoration freshly again, really for the first time since I'd been a child, and presenting to the Lord the question of, who am I? And it was the first time in my life I asked Him to define me to myself and to tell me who I was. And because I realized all these identities I had constructed as who I was had ended, and yet I still was existing, and so they weren't my essence. And then I proceeded to tell Him that He wasn't allowed to tell me that I was beautiful, that I was His daughter. I listed all these traits that I didn't want to hear, mainly because I wanted to make sure I wasn't speaking for Him. And I heard back very clearly after a long listing of things He couldn't say, are you finished? And I was stubborn, and so I said, no, I'm not finished. And then I knew, after sitting with it for a period, I couldn't think of anything further that He wasn't allowed to say. And I said, yes, I am finished. And then simply and quietly, I just heard, okay, you are mine. And I knew in that instant, I had never thought to tell Him, don't tell me I'm yours. And yet it was a summation of everything I wanted to hear. And so I just started to pursue what that would look like for me in my life, to be claimed by the Lord. And He led me to the Religious Sisters of Mercy of Alma, Michigan. They had at that time a convent in Denver at the Denver Seminary. And Bishop Conley then was the apostolic administrator of Denver. And I had grown close to him through various activities. We did the Camino de Santiago together, and And so I brought to him my vocational discernment, and he said that I first and foremost needed to look at the Sisters of Mercy. And right then his cell phone rang, and it was one of the sisters calling him. And so he answered it briefly, and then later hung up and said, "I insist you speak with them now."
That is awesome.
And so he sometimes teases me and says he answered my call for me. But
Sister, maybe you could even give a little shout out and explain your order to people who are not familiar. So I went to medical school at Michigan State, and I did 2 years in Midland, and several of my professors at a secular medical school were nuns, sisters in your order, who were doctors. And it was really amazing for me to talk to my other medical students. They're like, what is the deal with these ladies? And just a cool way to evangelize. Just tell folks about your order a little bit.
Yeah, so I'll tell about the order from kind of the way when I met the sisters. So as I said, Bishop Conley introduced me to them. And when I met the sisters in Denver, they explained to me how our community professes 4 vows of poverty, chastity, obedience. Those are the 3 evangelical counsels. But then a 4th vow of service of the poor, sick, and ignorant. And that our community interprets that vow to pursue intellectual development to a terminal degree for each sister. So that we can give ourselves to be of service to the church, however she asks, in whatever way is needed. And so at that point in time, the sister with whom I was speaking had several different doctorates, including one in agronomy. And she had taught farmers how to farm in Minnesota, and now was teaching seminarians how to be priests. And with her theology doctorate in liturgy, and she said she still used what she had learned from being a doctoral farmer. And it felt like in that moment that every single door in my heart was being opened, and this breath of wind was just breathing in me and through me, because I had never thought, I thought of my mind of being of service, and I thought of my body, like, giving of myself, but I just hadn't thought that I could actually give of my mind to the church in such a way that my mind would go where I was told to go, and that my mind would follow the Lord wherever He asked me to go, and to imagine that as part of a vow, to give myself to such a degree for the poor, sick, and ignorant was transformative for me. And so that's really why there are several different doctors, sisters, physicians to professors or education for like elementary education sisters. But it's all looking comprehensively at the human person, recognizing we all suffer with ignorance and sickness and poverty at different times and in different manners. And so it provides for a very fluid way in which we can be of service. But another way that I've loved this vow is syntactically service of the poor, sick, and ignorant. It's not service to, but in our constitutions, it's service of. And I've grown also in my way of understanding to see that not only as that I give the best and pursue the highest formation spiritually and intellectually, but I also give my weakness and give that to the Lord as well. And so that my poverty and my sickness and my ignorance can, in some mysterious way, also be of service to the church.
But this is clearly the Brainiac sisters. I can see this. It would be terrible. I could imagine Bishop Conley having to talk to 2 sisters, and he says to Sister Brigid, "You're going to this order," and then he says to the sister next to you, "You're not going to this order. This is the Brainiac order."
It's a very cool charism that I'm really impressed by.
That's amazing. Tell us a little bit, Sister, about your work in Catholic healthcare systems.
So my work in particular, first I'll preface it generally. Our community is a refoundation of the Sisters of Mercy. In 1973, we were refounded. And we have a special emphasis on comprehensive health care. And that would entail the healthcare of the entire human being, body, soul composite. And so I was assigned to, as my first assignment, to St. Francis Health System when I was a novice, really with no medical background at all. My major in undergrad is early British literature. I could speak Middle English to you if you'd like, but I definitely can't speak medical terminology, probably even till today. But I came here really not knowing what I do, and it happened that our superior at the time, who I was assisting, she went away for 2 weeks, and she was on the general council, and so she was the co-chair of the ethics committee. And she handed me the pager, and she said, "We don't usually get many calls on this, so I don't think you'll get one. But if you do, this is what happens." And so, sure enough, while she was gone, there were about 7 calls, and 4 of them were urgent, and I had to arrange meetings, And so when she returned, and I was in touch with her while she was gone, but when she returned, I handed her and it wasn't until law school that I realized I had really written briefs on the cases, but I handed her the work of the cases that I had done, and she took the paperwork, and on top of it was the pager, and she returned to the pager to me and said, "You're going to be keeping this." And that was how I entered into ethics. I had no formal background in it, and loved it and had a penchant for it, and I love St. Francis in particular, but comprehensively Catholic healthcare and the ministry, the beautiful intersection of provider bringing Christ to patient, and patient bringing the wounded, vulnerable Christ to the provider.
Well, amen, amen, sister. Now, listeners that follow the news at all realize that your system has recently had a tremendous victory, and a lot of people know about the candle. So maybe you could summarize what was going on there and what happened and what the victory was all about.
Yeah, so it's interesting, it kind of goes to fiduciary duties, which we can talk about a little later as well. But ultimately, as fundamentally, the right to worship God and His right to be worshipped. And so, there was an overarching question of the difference between a living flame in the sanctuary candle and an electric light bulb. But we fundamentally believe that Jesus Christ is living and present in the Blessed Sacrament. And to identify that and articulate it, that's the living flame, is to indicate that living presence in a way that an electric light bulb really can't. In fact, the general instructions of the Roman Missal have indicated that, and other instructive sources from the USCCB itself, and canon law and church tradition, and so that has never been a question in our mind that we would ever go electric. And so the Joint Commission, which is an accreditations organization used by CMS, which is a sub-branch of HHS.
Mostly to keep hospitals safe for the patient, right?
Right, yeah. And in the ideal form, CMS is the agency that gives out Medicare, Medicaid funding. And so they don't want to give the funding to a place that would be subpar. And so but at the same time, don't have time to make sure that every individual institution and provider is providing sufficient levels of care, quality of care. So they delegate that task to accreditation agencies such as the Joint Commission,
sure,
to do that legwork, to confirm that that institute is operating at a level that would be worthy of receiving federal dollars.
Because, Sister, I know listeners are wondering, why in the world does the federal government care if a hospital has a candle burning? But it gets down to this safety issue with accreditation, correct?
So there's a life safety code that says that there cannot be an open flame within less than 1 foot distance from a nasal cannula.
And listeners, that's a tube that goes in the nose that delivers oxygen.
And so that was the main one that was being cited to us, that there were certain factual inquiries that could be had of how this sanctuary candle, which is double encased in glass with a top on top of it, is actually an open flame. And also the factual inquiry of how a person with a nasal cannula would ever get within 1 foot distance of it when it's 7 feet up in the air. And the person's already a compromised individual, would have to climb a ladder in order to get within that distance.
On oxygen.
And so all those factual inquiries definitely were there. They went against the compelling interest of the government, but ultimately we don't know why, because it really wasn't, it didn't have a rational basis to it, let alone a strict scrutiny, which would have been the requirement that the government would have to satisfy.
It's always encouraging to hear about the federal government protecting us, especially in our hospital care from sanctuary
those dangerous
candles.
Yeah, I've felt threatened many times.
Sister, I wonder if maybe we've got a lot we want to get into about the role of Catholic hospitals. We've got to take a little break, so we'll take a brief break and we'll come right back here on Dr. Doctor.
Well, welcome back to Dr. Doctor, and welcome to our discussion with Sister Brigid Mary Meeks, who is a sister in the Religious Sisters of Mercy and an attorney. So, Sister, continuing our discussion about Catholic hospitals, in a simplistic way, what does it mean for a hospital to say, we're a Catholic hospital?
So, in order to be Catholic, the local ordinary has to grant that hospital permission in order to use that title. And so that's where in the history, we've kind of seen certain instances, very few, where a local ordinary might say temporarily, until you can satisfy my expectations of what it would mean to be Catholic, we are removing this title from you because you are not operating as an extension of the church.
Now, Sister, you're an attorney, so we'll stop you. You say ordinary. We would usually say bishop.
Yes.
And you selected ordinary because that's part of their role.
Yes. Yeah.
Good.
So the bishop of a diocese would be the one with the jurisdiction of the name, who has authority over the name of Catholic. And in a particular way, education and healthcare are uniquely entrusted by Christ to the bishop. It's part of the divine mandate that Christ gave to the apostles. Heal the sick, curate enfermos, he tells them, like as a command. And so they've delegated that now to these Catholic entities to participate ultimately in the healing ministry that's been uniquely entrusted to them as princes of the church. And so they have the authority over it, of what it means to be Catholic and what it means to be extending Christ's healing ministry. And ultimately, that's really what it means. Now, the Catholic hospitals are going to be nonprofit because they're not in it for making money. They're in it for serving Christ and his people, and serving his people with Christ himself. And so what that means then as a nonprofit corporation, as opposed to a for-profit corporation, would be that they both would have fiduciary duties. Corporate for-profit corporations and nonprofit corporations have fiduciary duties of loyalty and care, and that is what happens with any faith-based relationship, whether it be a trust, guardianship, any type where the control is separated from the owner. And so for-profit corporations, the owner is the shareholder, and the controllers are the board of directors and the officers. And so the controllers have responsibilities to the shareholders of loyalty, meaning they have to put the shareholders' interest above their own, and care. And if they don't, and if it can be proven, the shareholders then can sue the officers and or the board for breach of those duties. And a lawsuit could look like financial, which you would think of kind of just immediately, but it also could be an injunctive relief, which would be asking the court to command a certain action or inaction of the board of directors or the officers.
Sister, is that really the main hammer, I guess, that the bishops have, is they can just remove the right for a hospital to use the phrase Catholic? Or does
I think right now that's the only one that we've used or been aware of. And unfortunately, no bishop, no one ever wants to see that name removed, because and it's in many senses, if you ask the question, what does it mean to be Catholic healthcare? Healthcare can't exist without the church. The Catholic healthcare is the model of healthcare. And hospitals, it's well understood that the first hospitals, as we know it today, came from the church. And in fact, there's Hospital Architectural and Design magazine, secular magazine, explained the floor plan of hospital floors, how they are direct descendants of Catholic hospital floor plans, though a little different today. So the Catholic hospital floor plan in the Middle Ages had beds that radiated off of the altar.
Wow.
And it was and this article in a secular magazine said that somehow that altar participated in the healing process of the patient facing the altar. And that today that floor plan still persists, but instead of the altar, it's the nurse's station. And so it's fascinating. You can see how it still continues today. The altar used to be the nurse's station, that, and
That's
so
cool.
the agony really that bishops are in, that the church experiences when we have to separate out that which should never be separated, what Christ has joined. It's a certain divorce that should never happen. It is a great suffering that the hospital itself knows a bishop will never want to do. And so because of that, I think we're put in certain situations where sometimes the line is towed and crossed very closely. And with that knowledge of that hammer is sheathed under lots of locks. And so the fiduciary duty actually is another tool where bishops can look at how they might be able to assert their authority over Catholic hospital to ask them to do something, and through an injunctive relief, or even saying I could do this to them, and to let them know, it's not just stripping your title, but I have something else in my toolbox here. And so for a nonprofit, now I said that for for-profit, shareholders are the owner. Interestingly and beautifully, in nonprofit law, there are no shareholders. The owner of the nonprofit organization is the mission. And so the board of directors and the officers have duties of loyalty, care, and obedience to the mission of that entity. And the bishop would be able to plead special standing as a representative and a vicar of the Catholic mission of healthcare.
I love it, because that, so often when you hear headlines and you're like, why doesn't that bishop do something about this? I think a lot of times we on the outside don't recognize that there's really limited options sometimes as what they actually can do, unless you go all the way and just sever ties, which is imprudent in some cases, I'm sure, because then you have no conversation whatsoever after that.
Right.
So this sounds like a novel approach to help the bishops influence Catholic healthcare in a new way.
Yes.
Because I know
to really open up dialogue.
I'm sure listeners can think of examples of Catholic health systems that are more or less Catholic. And there have been some isolated instances of late, I believe, where bishops have become very involved in the identity of systems that are not necessarily adhering to the teachings of the church. But that's a tough spot for any bishop to find themselves in, I'm sure.
Yes, yeah, and so just to even explicate how there's an overlap with fiduciary duties and theology, the living flame example. On one hand, you could look at it purely from a religious liberty argument, and that is what we went with, and where I would go again and again and again. However, also our mission at St. Francis is to extend the presence and healing ministry of Christ in all that we do. And we have duties of loyalty, care, and obedience to that mission. And so the very act, you only blow out that candle when Jesus is no longer present in the tabernacle. And so fundamentally, the very act of extinguishing the candle would be going against the mission of St. Francis. And so you could look at that and say, not only is this a violation of our religious liberties, but it's a violation of our very essence, of who we are as a Catholic healthcare organization, legally speaking.
When I hear you describe that, I think of that bizarre interface between the federal government, doesn't get more secular than that, and the tabernacle and the presence of Christ. And you've got people on the one side of that discussion who would argue this stuff doesn't even exist, and on the other side you have people that are fighting with all they have for their freedom to burn that candle. What a tough interface of forces. Now we know which of the forces is greater, but still, that's quite a battle of the titans, isn't it?
Yeah. It's the walking on the waves. The waves are tall, absolutely. But our God made those, and with our eyes fixed on Him, we can walk on top of them.
Sister, I guess another thing I wanted to cover while we have you here, you are starting a program at your hospital there about a response team for human trafficking. I know clinically I've been in situations where the whole care team, I'm thinking of the emergency room in particular, unfortunately everybody kind of sees what's going on, whether it's some type of domestic violence or even more formal trafficking of some type, but there's not a clear action plan. And on the medical side of things, a lot of times we can encourage, we can approach, but really the woman has to decide now is the time to leave. It sounds like you're trying to bridge that gap by having resources available when these people are identified. Can you tell us about that program you're starting?
Yes, interestingly, this is also kind of couched under my understanding of fiduciary duties, particularly of care. When I was studying bioethics, this idea was presented to me actually by my professor. Then at the time, he had a side project for me. He said, I was given this case as a bioethicist and I couldn't find the answer. I want you to do the research and to tell me what your thoughts on it. And so the case was done and closed, so it was a post-mortem kind of, and he had also been brought in after the case was done and closed. It was a matter of a Catholic hospital, their identity being stripped, actually surrendered because they had a prostituted individual come through their doors regularly in the process of giving birth, and she would be on drugs. The baby would be born on drugs as well. DHS would be involved. The baby would be separated from the mother. Mother would be discharged, and a year later she'd be back in pregnant, giving birth on drugs, and it was the same routine. She had multiple abortions on her chart, and she was in her young 30s. And so one of the last time she came through those doors, the ethics committee got together and decided to sterilize her.
Oh my.
And so the bioethicist my professor asked me to try and understand what was the false good in that pursuit, because they certainly weren't intentionally pursuing direct harm. So what was it that they had bought into that was a perceived good that ultimately wasn't? And it took time for me to sit with it. At first, I was so repulsed by the idea. I didn't even want to think that there could be a false good in it. But as I sat with it, I realized the sorrow that the staff must have been encountering, and a certain despair of this patient coming back in, and them only being able to treat the physical and not be able to do anything to change the social issues or to provide a change in life for this individual. And I think that ultimately they came to the decision that doing something is better than doing nothing at all. And they did an evil. And so when I sat with that and started to realize the vulnerability that healthcare professionals are in dealing with this type of situation, but other situations that lead to despair and sorrow for the physician and the providers, the desire to create this program came from both a love for that vulnerable individual coming through the doors, but also a love for the vulnerable individual treating the patient, of wanting to provide an outlet of care so that the physician and the providers would be able to funnel their good desires of caring for this individual in a way that would be to her flourishing. So that was the foundation for why we started the program when I realized that St. Francis Health System didn't have one. And so ultimately, first, it's educating all staff on what the signs and symptoms of sex trafficking are, and then also equipping them with certain resources in how to respond, at least the ones who are in direct patient encounters.
But Sister, I would imagine most listeners, even now, as much as we've talked about sex trafficking, would still think that's a theoretical thing that happens in the movies, that it's not real. But what would you say to listeners, maybe by way of examples that you've seen of very real sex trafficking of human persons?
Yes. Yeah. Well, first, I'll just give the figures now. I can give one figure definitively. The other is going to get fuzzy because this is coming from memory now. But 43 million persons are estimated to be human trafficked worldwide. And that incorporates labor trafficking and sex trafficking. 79% of that human trafficking is sex trafficking.
Wow.
And so now is where the fuzzy memory comes in. Whatever the math is of 79% of 43 million, that's the number currently estimated, and it's an underestimation because it's really impossible to get the full figures of those who are currently being sex trafficked worldwide. And that the population of that, if you were to look at what does that mean contextually, it's more than the populations of London, New York City, Dallas, LA, the state of Kansas, the state of Oklahoma, and I think a few other in there combined, but all to say it's massive numbers. And so that's the current. And so then, even when I thought of that, I thought, okay, sure, but this is like Thailand and stuff, right? We're talking like third world countries and ex-Soviet countries and China, and not like that amount in America. And so I wanted to look at what are the countries of origin from which sex trafficking begins. And the top 3 nations of origin, according to the Department of Homeland Security, is the United States, Mexico, and the Philippines.
Wow.
And Mexico and the Philippines are intimately connected to us. So we are a destination nation for sex trafficking, but we're also an origination nation of it as well. Now, practically what it could look like. Just this past weekend, we had a 15-year-old come through. She was complaining of cramps, and they did an ultrasound, and she was 10 weeks pregnant. Now, the name she gave, we didn't have a record on her, and the person she was with, who was her boyfriend, gave a different date of birth. And she corrected him. The date that he gave would have made her 19. The date she gave made her 18. And so, but she was quite timid. And so the nurses called me to come and support them. They were doing a great job, but they had, despite all their efforts, they weren't able to really crack through. They had separated her from the significant other, her trafficker. And when I came in, she had just gotten the ultrasound printout, and she's looking at her baby, and that was the breakthrough for her.
Wow.
Though still, I'm talking with her, and I spoke with her for about an hour, really trying to, there was nothing. It was, I'm 18 years old, I'm behind in school, I'm finishing things up, and I mean, all of us were like, well, maybe this is just an inappropriate relationship. And just, he might be emotionally abusive, but we could be wrong. And this is us coming from being the ones who are studying it day in and day out. And so then ultimately I say to her, you have this new life in you. and we want peace for you, and we want peace and flourishing for this baby. And she started crying and then collected herself and still wasn't giving anything. So we had to run some other tests, and they sent her back out to the waiting room while they ran the test because we were slammed with persons in and didn't have a bed for her at that time. And so when she went back out to the waiting room, she was rejoined with the trafficker. And if we had had any signs, that this wasn't, or that this was trafficking, we certainly wouldn't have done that, but we just weren't able to find anything. Meanwhile, though, I went back to the convent, and about an hour later, the phone rings and she's gone back up to the triage window. And now she gives us her real name, and she gives us her real date of birth. And she says she needs help. And so they say it takes on average 7 offers before a person is able to receive the help for an out. And we don't know if the person falls within the average, if we're time number 7, or if they're outside the average, but we just know that it takes a lot of offers.
Wow.
And it can be a UTI that's gone untreated. It really can be anything that brings the person in.
Sister, that's a beautiful story, and I think that hopefully you guys are going to be a leader for the healthcare system nationwide to have response programs to address that. In the last minute or two of our conversation, I wonder if there's any resources, especially for the human trafficking, that we could point listeners to if they want to learn more, or if they are inspired to try and bring this to their community.
The one resource that I recommend over and over and over again, now granted, there can be colorful language in the videos because it's direct interviews, but it's a website called thelifestory.org, and all spelled out, put together, thelifestory.org. This organization wanted to find, they had this idea that there must be repeat markers in sex trafficking where there are opportunities for intervention that could be predictable. And so they interviewed dozens upon dozens of sex trafficking survivors, and they did find these points of intersection. And one of them is healthcare. And they did video interviews of them for all of these points of intersection that are very compelling. And the message that, particularly with the healthcare one, that I always emphasize to the staff and emphasize to anyone interested is it's not rocket science. This is a relationship. And it's really identifying the dignity of the human in front of you and saying, I see you, I hear you, and I care about you, and I'm worried. And so there's one of the interviewers, persons being interviewed, said that the doctor just said to her, "Are you going to be okay?" And she said, at that moment, I couldn't admit what was happening in my life. She said, but I never forgot that he noticed and that he asked if I'd be okay.
Wow.
And it seems like, that was nothing. You would go home and not even realize like what that seed did. But decades later, she's talking about a doctor asking if she'd be okay.
Wow,
so I just would like that to be the takeaway, to not feel overwhelmed by it, but to just put your heart out there and to let them know they're cared for.
That's beautiful. Well, Sister Brigid Mary Meeks, we can't thank you enough for your work and for you giving us some time and joining us here on Dr. Doctor.
Well, thank you all. It's been a privilege.
Thank you.
Welcome back to Dr. Doctor, and welcome to this episode's answer to the medical trivia question, which not surprisingly deals with Catholic hospitals.
Yes. What percentage? I'm a percentage guy. Tom always makes these questions with like A, B, C, D, or E options. Give me one percentage. So what percentage of hospitals in America are run by Catholic health systems? The answer is 15%.
But a more practical term is 1 in 7 patients are cared for in a Catholic hospital. That really, 15% I think is hard. But 1 in 7, that's easier to get your brain around.
That's an awful lot.
We're still a driving force in the delivery of healthcare.
And it's, I think, a huge opportunity for us to showcase to all these patients, who a lot of them are not Catholic, what it means to be Catholic. Talk about evangelization.
Yeah, great point. Well, as we think about the top 3 takeaways, what comes to mind for you?
The thing that I wish we had to talk more about, we'll have to delve into this more in the future, is using this new fiduciary duty.
And fiduciary means money.
Yeah, that's right.
It's simple.
Trust and money.
Yeah, that's right.
For the Latin people, fiducia. But using this new angle to hammer on non-for-profit corporations to get them to do what their mission says to do.
Yeah.
And I love that, sister. What a beautiful way to use a legal mind and a religious vocation to help the church and help the bishops keep Catholic healthcare doing what it should be doing.
Yeah, that is beautiful.
How about you, Chris? What's number 2?
Well, I'm not sure why, but when she said she was describing bishops and she described them as the princes of the church, it sort of caught me. And it's true. They're the descendants of Peter. The bishop that you see at confirmation or at some other sacrament at your parish could very well be the Pope one day. And they're the princes of the church to carry on that sacred tradition. And I just love that phrase, the princes of the church. We should remember that when you say hello to your bishop. You're speaking to a prince of the church.
Yeah, it's our culture is so casual, but it's elevated.
Yeah.
That's a significant role.
And then my favorite takeaway was she described the waves being tall. And that God made those waves, and with His help, we can walk atop them. And I think she was describing no battle is too big when right is on your side. And they took on the federal government over the religious freedom of burning their candle.
Isn't that incredible?
And the feds backed down. You can't beat City Hall? Well, you can when God's on your side.
That is pretty cool. Well, thank you, everybody, for listening to another episode of Dr. Doctor. Please remember to pray for your bishops and pray for your local Catholic hospital because they need it. You can find all of our old episodes on our website, drdoctor.org. Just click Episode Archive at the top. We have 300-plus episodes, and you can search by topic or by guest.
And if you'd like, you can actually watch us on video on drdoctor.org. Click on that. You can also submit a question if there's something you'd like us to speak to. We'd love to hear from you.
This is Dr. Andrew Mullally.
And this is Dr. Chris Stroud. We're signing off until your next dose of Dr. Doctor.